Welcome back to Brussels, where this agenda, will be dominating our next two topics of discussion. We're going to talk about the situation in Tunisia and Egypt, which will be part of the debate today that's taking place today in Brussels. It's 15:42 British time. The last time I looked, Egypt was still there. It may not be now, but Arthur Kemp, what do you make of the situation in Egypt?
I think it's an inevitable natural consequence of the rising tide of Islamism throughout the Muslim world, which has actually been on the back burner for a little while in the Muslim world itself, mainly due to the regimes which exist in the Arab world, which have been propped up by the West for a number of decades. And now the rising tide of Islamism is now catching up with those nations.
Yeah, when we heard of the allegations that the CIA, the Americans, had been involved in instigating, supporting, perpetuating these protests, especially in Egypt, it's a difficult concept to actually take on board, isn't it? Where do you think the logic is in that kind of interference, should it be happening?
There probably isn't direct interference per se, but you can see very clearly from American foreign policy, it's designed to export their version of democracy to the world. And America is what's known as a creedist nation. The elite which rules America believes in a common creed. They don't believe in a people or a nationhood as maybe Europeans understand it. The American ruling elite, not Americans per se, but the American ruling elite believes that if everyone just endorses a common creed, it'll all be fine and hunky-dory. That's the rationale behind, for example, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They believe that if they can get Israeli Jews and Palestinians out of the Middle East and let them all immigrate to America, all of a sudden they'll all get along, all peaceful and happy and kind. That's the common creed which they endorse. And there's no doubt that the ruling elite in America seeks to impose that common creed on the rest of the world. You could have seen, the best example I can give you was Madeleine Albright at the height of the Yugoslavian Civil War, where she objected to the Serbians and the Croats taking away these states because she said specifically that the time for ethnically homogeneous states is past.
Yeah.
So that's the type of ideology which drives them. Unquestionably, there will be elements within that elite who will have instigated uprisings against what they regard as undemocratic regimes. Where the problem comes in, of course, is what actually replaces it. And you'll find, as I suspect what will happen, is that organizations such as the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt will eventually start taking on a dominating role.
Yeah. Switching to you, Nick, I mean, you've got an actual role in this parliamentary process tomorrow when you'll be voting on a number of amendments regarding Tunisia. Our problem is these things start off, and ostensibly they actually look quite good with supporting the Tunisians and whatever, but deep down, with all of this interference, there's a bit more of a sinister motive, isn't there?
Well, there is. Certainly, there's no doubt that, say, in Tunisia, Egypt, or virtually the whole way along the Maghreb, you've got these fairly unpleasant tyrannical kleptocracies with a little ruling elite hoovering all the money up and oppressing people who complain and so on. In some of the countries where they've got enough oil revenue to buy the masses off, they've done so a bit more effectively than others. But that's basically the picture of it. And it is actually only natural, and I would say right in a way, to think, well, we wouldn't want to live under a regime like that. I can understand young Tunisians, young Egyptians not wanting to live like that either. And from our point of view as British nationalists, in many ways it would be better if those countries were free and secular and could get on running a decent economy, because then they'd be less likely to come to Britain and the West. Most people, let's face it, if you're living in Tunisia and it's all right, would you really want to go and live in Birmingham or Manchester? Where it's raining and it's cold and you're washing someone else's dishes. You'd rather actually be in your own country, I think. And of course, their own countries are ruled by these unpleasant dictatorships, so it is one of the drivers of immigration to the West. So if we could replace those unpleasant dictatorships with something that looks like our model, that'd be tremendous. But the problem is it's very unlikely to happen, because, as Arthur was saying, people like the Muslim Brotherhood are far better organised than any other opposition party. They're absolutely devoted, fanatical about their beliefs and imposing their society. They'll die for it, quite happily. So something which is going to come out of this at the end will be much, much worse from everyone's point of view, than what we had now. It's a little bit like when the Americans and us on their tails went in to get rid of Saddam Hussein. And it appears no one bothered to think that however unpleasant Saddam Hussein was, what was going to replace him would be a damn sight worse. Or when the powers that be in the West happily threw the Shah of Iran to the wolves, who at that stage were, half of them were communists, the other half were Islamists, and the communists thought they could use the Islamists to come to power, and found that when you ride the tiger you get eaten. Yet how on earth these fluffy, floppy liberals, who undoubtedly are in these countries, think they can beat the Muslim Brotherhood when the Communist Party couldn't, when they had the Soviet Union behind them? I simply do not know. So what is going to end up is going to be absolutely horrible. And of course the European Union pushing for it, they have, as you said, got an agenda which really is pretty unhealthy, which I know, Arthur, you've got some comments on this, in terms of this long-term drive basically to unify Europe and the nations of the Maghreb.
That's right. It's something that's not really actually quite well known amongst the public. It's something known as the Barcelona Agreement, which is a long-term project, and you can Google it and look it up. It's a long-term project of the EU which has, at its ultimate aim, it's got the initial aims are to encourage cooperation and common well-being, but its ultimate long-term aim is to actually unify, to amalgamate North Africa into Europe. And that's the specific stated long-term goal. And so, of course, you probably get people saying, yes, let's have democracy, democratic revolutions in North Africa, in the hope that it is a democratic outcome. Presumably they're hoping for some type of Turkey outcome, where you've got a sort of semi-secular state, Muslim state, where it's sort of normal and rational and partly that. But of course, Turkey's only the way it is because there's a very strong secular element which controls the military. And when that eventually goes, nothing will stop Turkey from becoming a full-blooded Islamist nation as well. And there's no such counterbalance in these North African states.
Yeah, indeed. That's just thinking about Turkey in particular. We've had several very fascinating meetings of the Turkey Assessment Group here in Europe, and several of the speakers there have brought this out. And when you actually look at the history of it, and in particular talking to several people from Cyprus, where they were here to talk about the destruction of Christian churches in the Turkish-occupied north, they raised the truly shocking point. You think in terms of Islam as having been something terribly dangerous in the past, but having got softer. And they pointed out that these churches in Cyprus, which of course before the British took it over in the 19th century, had been occupied by the Ottoman Empire, by Turkey, by the same Islamic forces that nearly crashed through the great gates of Vienna. That nevertheless, the churches that have been destroyed in the last few years by a Muslim fundamentalist drive have been there all through the rule by the Ottoman Empire.
Correct.
So the Ottoman Empire, in fact, did allow minorities, Christians of various stripes and Jews, to have the people of the book. They did allow them to have their churches and synagogues. Yes, they were second-class citizens, and they had to pay the special jizya tax and so on, but they still had their rights within the thing respected. They had their place and they were entitled to that place, and they weren't, as a rule, wholesale exterminated. And the exterminations of the Armenians and so on are really quite recent, and the utter destruction of Christian civilization in northern Cyprus, it's modern Islam. This isn't old Islam. It's not where it's come from. It's where it's going. And when you then consider that the Turkish brand of Islam is still, in fact, softer and slightly more moderate than the version that comes out of the Wahhabists in Saudi Arabia, who finance virtually every new mosque in Britain. They're softer than the Deobandi, who's the sort of the Wahhabi equivalent in Pakistan and northern India. And as I say, you look at what Islam has done in the past, and you must understand that what it's doing right now and in the future is actually even worse. It truly is a terrifying prospect.
It is terrifying is the word. When I looked at the BBC report of what was happening in Egypt and Tunisia to a lesser extent, they emphasised again and again that it was young Muslim men who were the driving force behind that. And we look to Britain and we look at the demographics there, and we see the amount of difference there is between our birth rate and the Islamic birth rate, you realise that in 30 years' time, if we're not very careful, that very same dynamic will be out on the streets in Manchester, Bradford and Leeds. You feel the same way?
Absolutely. I tell you what else I found highly disturbing was looking at a list of questions which Nick had submitted to the European Commission for answer, and one of them was a question on what the EU's figures were on the relationship between the numbers of indigenous European people as opposed to immigrant European people, immigrants in Europe. Let me phrase that carefully. And the EC's answer, which came back, was that, oh, well, they reckon 3.5% or 3.57% of the European population has nationality of another nation, and they have no further stats on it whatsoever. And then you realize that there's actually a very sinister motive at work here, because the EU, as unquestioned with the human rights legislation, which the Human Rights Act in the UK is merely a reflection of the EU rules on it, then you realize that there's actually a very serious and sinister motivation in not only encouraging this mass immigration, especially from North Africa and the Arab nations, and they're trying to bring Turkey in as well now, but there's also a deliberate policy of covering it up. Pretending it's not happening, and then outright lying about the actual figures. And when you add all of that together into a pot, it actually makes for a very disturbing scenario, and very disturbing what's going on inside the EU.
Yeah, it is terrifying, isn't it? It's truly terrifying, and the irony of it is that you've mentioned this, Nick, I've mentioned it, other BNP politicians have mentioned it, and the more we seem to try and mention it, the more they try and suppress us, don't we? I notice, for instance, there's going to be a debate about global warming. You mentioned before about the taxes, the 18 billion in taxes. It's accepted that the Green Party, who got less of a vote than we got in Oldham, can take part in a major debate. But when we talk about things which should pertain to our sphere of influence, immigration or Islamicisation, we are consistently snuffed out, and people who are wholly inappropriate are put in their place.
Indeed. Well, we know why. On the way over, we stopped at an English supermarket, and what we have, 4 people shaking my hand, photo taken, talking to us because they recognise that the British National Party, ordinary people, recognise the British National Party has talked about issues which perhaps don't affect their absolutely everyday life right now. Yeah. So they don't always translate into votes. But they know that on the issues, if they think about the future, the big picture stuff, they know that we've spoken out at considerable personal cost in various ways on these issues. And I've no doubt that the focus groups that the governing body has, the governing party, has at its disposal, the focus groups that the police and so on have at their disposal to take the temperature of what the public are feeling and thinking and so on, to keep their finger on the pulse. They'll have known for several years that there's this immense respect for what we've done, just to survive, actually. People know people have a vague idea of the kind of pressure we put under. They see how unfairly we're treated on television, and we still keep coming back for more. And there's this immense respect for us. And the elite look at this, and if everything was hunky-dory with their system, they wouldn't give a damn. No. But they know that behind and above all the problems that they've got, imposing their globalist agenda, and with the problem of radical Islam and potential terrorist attacks, on top of all that, they've got a slow-motion train crash in economic terms, in terms of the world's financial system, it's gone. It's finished. It's imploding. All that's going on now is the various banking elites and so on finding ways to suck the last bit of lifeblood out before it goes down the tubes. And I think the political parties in power who've contributed to that system, have let it go on, they're going to be sitting in the middle of this wreckage at some stage in the future. None of us knows when, but I think probably sooner, a damn sight sooner than they hope. And they're trying to get rid of us beforehand from Britain. They're trying to get rid of nationalists from the European Parliament. They want the alternative voice, the voice of ordinary people, out of the way, so that whatever goes wrong, they can say, well, it's terribly sorry it's gone wrong, but we're the only people here to put it right again.
Not go one stage further and say they want the voice, not just the voice of ordinary people, they want ordinary people out of the way. And on that note, that's the end of our second part. We'll be back and we'll have more subject matter from this agenda in a few minutes' time.